In the previous video, we saw how variety selection can help us improve the yields and the quality of our crops. This video, we're going to look at the actual management of production, how to manage our production in such a way so as to improve our productivity. We are going to do this by looking at something called cropping patterns. We're going to look at soil nutrients, which is basically the nutrition for the plants in the soil, irrigation, harvesting and storage, and finally packaging and transport. Now, remember to take notes while this video is going on. There's a lot of stuff that's going to be said. Much of it will be useful for you. So it will be useful for you not only in this video, but in subsequent videos to actually take notes of the things that you find useful. Let's begin. Cropping patterns. So we're going to look at something called monoculture, and then we're going to look at another form called intercropping, and then finally we'll look at something called crop rotation. So let's begin. What is monoculture? So monoculture is basically when we take a crop and we grow just that one crop in an entire area. That is called monoculture. Apple is essentially the practice in Himachal is monoculture, where apples are growing. The entire hillside will be covered with apples. Not much else is grown normally in these areas. Wheat is most commonly also grown as in monoculture. As opposed to monoculture, you have something called intercropping. Now, in intercropping, you will plant a few lines of something and then you plant a few lines of something else. Uh, Very commonly, for example, in Himachal, you will have rajma or kidney beans, which is intercropped with maize. What are the advantages of this? Let's see in the next slide. So monoculture. Monoculture is advantageous because there is a standard treatment for the entire crop, right? The entire area has either mustard or wheat, and because of that, the pesticides we need, the fertilizers we apply, everything is standard. The equipment we need, the packaging we need to buy, everything is standard. If you compare this with intercropping, you have one line which has a particular period of ripening, let's say in mid July, and the next one might um, ripen in mid August. This means that you might need labor at two different times in the year. Well, in some cases, this is advantageous. For example, if you have a shortage of labor, it might actually be better to have crops that mature at different times. Monoculture, for example, cherries. When all cherries ripen at the same time, you need a large quantity of labor. So, a monoculture is thereby disadvantageous in this regard. On the other hand, when you talk about intercropping, actually harvesting might be complicated because the crops grow into each other. You cannot use machines easily because you have alternating lines of things, so it can become problematic. Also, if you look at it from the point of view of diseases, when you have monoculture, disease in fact spread can spread through the entire area because there is nothing blocking the spread of that disease. However, when we see intercropping, very often the diseases that affect one plant do not affect the other, and therefore the fact that you have intercropped them prevents the spread of diseases. Now we look at something called crop rotation. When we have annuals, that is plants that actually have a life cycle of less than 1 year, we often grow them in rotation. In this case, you can see that soybean is being planted in one season and maize is planted in another season. Now, what are the advantages of crop rotation? Well, if you look at maize is something that uses a large quantity of nitrogen. But the soybean shown here is something that is capable of nitrogen fixation. In fact, what it does is it takes nitrogen from the air and it fixes them as nitrates in the soil. and these nitrates will become available to maize the next time that you plant it. So, crop rotation has the possibility of adding balance. Some people make the mistake of saying that crop rotation always adds balance. That is not true, but done scientifically, you can make sure that what one crop uses, the other crop replaces to some extent. Now, let's look at the business of soil nutrients. Okay, now, because agriculture is the business of producing large quantities of food, and food contains, for example, proteins, the plant itself needs a source from which to make those proteins. It requires the raw materials. And if we don't talk about industrial scale farming, these plants are capable of extracting that from the environment. But when we want our crops to produce large quantities of food, then we have to externally enrich the soil with certain nutrients. And that is what we're going to discuss here under two headers. One is the use of naturally sourced manures, and the other is chemical fertilizers. Now, why do we add these? So we add these primarily for three macronutrients, three nutrients which the plant needs. They are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Their symbols are NPK. Potassium is given the symbol K because in Latin stands for kalium. So you have NPK. Now, how do we add these to the soils? So one way is to use inorganic sources. You may have heard of the inorganic fertilizers, for example, something called Barabattis sola, which has why is it called Barabattis sola? Because it has nitrogen, which is nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus and potassium in the ratio 12 is to 32 is to 16. That's why it is called that. And same way you have bara bara bara, which means it has them in the ratio of 12 is to 12 is to 12, which could also be written as a ratio of 1 is to 1 is to 1. You must have heard of urea. Urea is another inorganic fertilizer. Urea only provides the plant with an inorganic source of nitrogen. You may have heard of something called CAN. Stands for calcium ammonium nitrate. So this supplies the plant with both a source of nitrogen and calcium. We also use a large amount of organic sources. These have an additional benefit apart from actually giving NPK to the soil. They also impart a certain structure. They allow for the soil to retain moisture if it is dry, and they allow soil to drain moisture if it is clayey. So there's several sources of manure. One is livestock, which are the animals that we keep, and the other is something we call green manure, which we will look at a little later. We also have something called vermicompost and compost. So whenever we take green material and we allow that green material to decay using bacteria and fungi, we call that compost. If we allow it to decay using earthworms, that is called vermicompost. So vermicompost, in fact, is something that is not derived from livestock but is highly useful. Now, why do we choose to use earthworms? Why not just bacteria and fungi? Because actually earthworms are much faster at doing it because they are larger organisms. So we can convert a larger quantity of green material into vermicompost. This is typically used where we have large amount of vegetable wastes like sabzi mandis, or our household waste can in fact be converted into vermicompost reasonably fast and efficiently, and this can be moved back into fields where it can provide those nutrients back to the plants for use. Livestock manure, so we take cow dung or we take the dung of various animals and we mix it with the grass that is useless, the grass that we find no use for, or the vegetable matter that we find no use for. And the presence of the cow dung allows a fermentation reaction to start, where The grass is then broken down, and we get this we get livestock manure, which can then be used in our fields. Let's talk about green manure. So it's not necessary for some animal to eat the plant material before we put it back in the soil. One of the other things that can be done is green manure, where we can in fact grow plants. You can see on the right hand side you have things called green manure crops. When the field is fallow, when it is empty for, let's say, a short season, we can plant these green manure crops, and as they grow, we till them and we turn them back into the soil. You might wonder, but they've sucked the nutrients from the soil and we're tilling them back. What's the point? These green manure crops are capable of taking atmospheric nitrogen and fixing that into the soil, so that when we put them back into the soil, it in fact enriches the soil. The soil is richer than it was before. So this is another idea, although it's not very widely used. This is another idea that some places have used. Let's talk about water. In different parts of the country, the ways in which we provide water to our fields is different. We might use wells, canals. In the hills, we use something called a cool. We may use tanks, and then from there, we may deliver it using different systems, all of which we will look at over here. Let's begin with the idea of a tube well or a bore well. So, what is done in a tube well is we dig down or we bore down to the subsurface rocks, and there, trapped between layers of rock, we find groundwater. That groundwater is either pumped up by the pressure of air, or more commonly by something called a submersible pump. Now, a submersible pump is just a pump that can actually be put inside water, and once it is placed inside water, it sucks and throws out water up a pipe. This is a submersible pump. Now, you also have dug wells in a large part of the country, which are different from bore wells because they are relatively large in diameter. However, today, in the modern day, very few places use dug wells. They were mostly used at a time when the drawing of water was done by hand and not by pumps. Wherever there are dug wells, you can put a submersible pump in and you can pump out the water. Wherever there is a shortage of water, we can divert the water, excess water from rivers into those areas by what we call canals. And these canals can be hundreds of kilometers long. One of the shortcomings of using something like a canal is that um, you cannot use this irrigation facility very far from the canal itself. So you have to have your field within a reasonable distance of the canal. In the hills, we have an ingenious system of canals called cools. And in these cools, what we do is we use the natural force of gravity to transport water. So wherever we have a khad or a nala, or basically a streamlet, we we channelize that water, and it's taken over long distances to supply to fields. This is the traditional system of irrigation. And then what happens is that sometimes the cools split into various parts, and you can share the water by blocking one side and allowing water to flow in the other. Then you have tanks. Wherever there's no flowing water, we might collect some spring water in a tank, or we might collect rainwater in a tank. And these tanks normally are made of concrete and are then used for irrigation. We will see the means that are used. Recently, we have started using something called pond liners, and these are quite effective. And it's something that, given the impending water crisis, it's important for all of you to know. These are large plastic sheets where we only need to dig a large hole in the mud, put the pond liner, and bury the edges of the pond liner with mud, and we are able to collect rainwater. The life of the pond liner, of course, depends on the quality and the thickness of the pond liner used. But these are not only usable for irrigation; it is also something that can be used for growing fish for commercial purposes. Now, One way of to manage water is actually to use polyhouses. We have some idea of polyhouses. Whenever a crop is irrigated inside a polyhouse, one of the things is when the water evaporates, it is not lost to the atmosphere. It simply condenses on the top of the polyhouse and it drips down in the morning. Water is largely conserved, and this is one of the great advantages of a polyhouse. Um, of course, we have now several rainwater harvesting tanks. We have seen the construction of tanks earlier. Now, from these tanks, how do we deliver water to our plants? Now, the most efficient system is what is called a drip irrigation system, which consists of a large series of pipes, and at regular distances on those pipes, you have little nodes, and at those nodes, you have an adjuster where you can adjust the node to give out water drop by drop by drop to the plant. This causes this in this method, all the water given, in fact, reaches just at the base of the plant. There is very little wastage of water by watering those areas where the plant roots do not exist. So, this is in fact the best way of delivering the water. Unfortunately, it requires a large storage tank, and it also requires this expensive system of pipes and nodes, which also need regular maintenance. So while it is the most efficient, it is also the most expensive. Following this, you have sprinkler irrigation. You must have seen this. You have pipes where water must be under pressure, and you have a device called a sprinkler, which sprinkles it like as though it were rain. One good thing about this is it requires much more water than drip irrigation, but less water than um, the form of irrigation you are about to see. So you have the traditional method of irrigation is what was called furrow or flood irrigation, where between lines of crops we make furrows, and in those furrows we send a flood of water. Now this is inefficient because the crop does not grow in the furrow. It in fact is growing on the ridges. So all the water that is absorbed by the furrows is more or less wasted, and this system is only useful in either the rainy season or in areas where water is aplenty. And especially with the modern shortage of water, this method of irrigation is slowly becoming obsolete. Now you have also something called hydroponics, which is actually growing of plants in the absence of soil. So you can grow plants without soil. What you need is you need water, and we add the nutrients directly into the water. And as you can see, the plants are actually grown inside a system of pipes, and the roots are dipped in this water. The water contains nutrients, and sometimes we might choose to aerate that water to keep oxygen levels high in that water, and that is sufficient. We don't need soil. And while it does require some amount of water, water loss in this method is almost zero. Whatever water is lost from the plant in its natural course. There is no actual water wastage in this method. Now let's come to the business of harvesting. So we have traditional manual harvesting of crops, and slowly, as time goes on, we are moving gradually towards mechanical or mechanized harvesting of crops. So here you can see a harvester, and that harvester is in fact on one side it's harvesting a crop, and it is directly loading that onto a tractor, thereby saving several man hours of labor. Now, when we talk about harvesting and storage, we have to look at, when we talk of storage, what are the causes of loss in storage. So we have insects, rodents like rats, fungi, arthropods called mites, and bacteria. All of these cause loss um, in this when we store our crop produce. And then, of course, you have abiotic factors which are not living, not caused by living things, like too much moisture or too little moisture. Too little moisture will cause the crop to dry out. Too much moisture might cause some defects. Also, the temperature at which we store it is also important. In this section, we're going to look at how our crop is to be stored. Now, when we store crops, we can store them in various ways. We might choose to store it in a go down, we might choose to store it in a silo, or we may choose to store it in a cold storage. Even cold storage are of two types. We'll have a look at these. First, we look at a go down. A go down is simply an enclosed space. In that enclosed space, we are able to store our produce and keep it away from, let's say, pests to some extent, or we are able to protect it from the wind and the elements to some extent. If you look at the picture on the right hand side, you have what is called a silo. So a silo is this cylindrical structure, and in that cylindrical structure, we are able to store large quantities of grain. One of the great advantages of these silos are there is no need for sacks. The grain can be stored and closed away. We can control how much air is entering. We can prevent the entry of insects. We can prevent the entry of moisture. Altogether, it is a much more controlled atmosphere. One of the other things about this is that sometimes when our agricultural produce is in liquid form, even liquids can be stored in silos. Now let's look at cold stores. So on the left hand side, you have a normal cold store, which is just a store with some refrigerating capability. Yeah, it is just maintained at 2 or 3 degrees, and that's it. Well, that's good enough. It's like keeping your agricultural produce in a fridge, which keeps it fresh for longer. But typically, in a regular cold store, the life of fruit might be a maximum. It might get extended by a maximum of 2 months or 3 months at the most, not more than that. In the modern day, we use something called a controlled atmosphere cold store. There are quite a few in Himachal now. In a controlled atmosphere cold store, we have nitrogen cylinders which are pumping nitrogen in order to reduce the quantity of oxygen inside the cold store. Of course, this means that human beings cannot roam around in there because the oxygen content is quite low. If we have to go in, first we have to open it out, air it out, then we can go in. Now, apart from pumping nitrogen in, also large quantities of moisture, of water vapor are pumped in. Why is this? This is to prevent the produce from drying. If it's a produce like apple, which are like apples, which after some time will become will start losing moisture. By pumping moisture in, we prevent evaporation and keep the apples, in fact, firm. Then you have something called a CO2 scrubber, which removes the CO2. As the apples are alive, we don't realize this, but the apples inside a cold store are actually alive and they're producing CO2. So that CO2 needs to be periodically removed to keep them fresh. And finally, you have something called an ethylene scrubber. Ethylene is, in fact, a hormone produced by ripening fruits like bananas and apples, and when an apple starts ripening, it starts giving off ethylene, and that ethylene causes more apples to ripen, and they give off more ethylene. So it's very important for us to control that ethylene using something called an ethylene scrubber, which removes the ethylene from the air. Here's a photograph of a controlled atmosphere cold store in Himachal Pradesh. Finally, we come to the business of packaging and transport. So traditionally, we packed things in wooden crates or sacks, and transport took on various forms. Most importantly, normally we would transport things in open trucks where it would take a long time for them to reach their destination. So the quality of the fruit or the amount of damage to the vegetable would be quite high by the time it reached. Um, Today, we have modern packaging systems which reduce or minimize the damage to the produce, and transport methods which also do so. One great saving of cost is in the automation of packaging. If you have ever been to an apple grading machine, in most orchards they have apple grading machines which sort them automatically by size, and they clean the apple surface is they shine the apples. However, if you go to the more advanced controlled atmosphere stores, they actually have the apples are tested with sound waves, or actually ultrasound waves, and they are also tested for whether they have defects inside the apple. They are photographed to see whether they have what's it called, whether they have defects on the outside. They are tested to see how much starch and how ripe they are, and the packaging thereafter is often automatic. So this is a great saver of time and cost, although the cost of setting it up is reasonably high. A great development which is only now beginning in India is called cold chain transport. Now, what is cold chain transport? So you might have a controlled atmosphere storage in, let's say, in Shimla, and another controlled atmosphere storage in Delhi. But the problem is, how do I get it from Shimla to Delhi without the fruit becoming hot and actually starting to ripen? So in order to have that, you have what is called a cold chain, which means you have these reefer trucks or refrigerated trucks which load the fruit from Shimla and are able to carry them refrigerated all the way to Delhi. Some of these reefer trucks actually have controlled atmosphere facilities in them, although in India this is still not very common. And with this, we end the with this section on the improvement of crop production.